It is our last day of the reading of Who Was Martin Luther King Jr. So I have another Who Was book planned for tomorrow, but it's a surprise. So you'll have to tune in tomorrow to see who is going to be our new read aloud, who we're going to be reading about. But today we're going to finish with chapter 11 of the Who Was book about Martin Luther King Jr. So a lot has happened so far. So if you haven't tuned in to some of the videos, make sure you go back and listen to those first because a lot of things have happened so far. But we're on chapter 11 called March On. If he couldn't get a city government to cooperate, Martin decided to go higher up. Martin and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference planned another march to Washington, D.C. for the spring of 1968. The purpose was to get Congress to pass laws that would help poor people get better jobs. Before the big march, Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis, Tennessee. Garbage workers were on strike. Martin wanted to help them get a pay raise. On March 28, 1968, Martin and the peaceful protesters set out on the streets of Memphis. Once again, the result was violence, but it was caused by some of the marchers. Some teenagers broke into a local store and stole things. A riot began. This went against everything that Martin stood for. Martin returned home to Atlanta and did not come back to Memphis until April 3rd. Some people were threatening to hurt Martin, but Martin was not afraid. He still hoped to help the striking garbage workers. Martin met some of the other city and civil rights leaders the next day. Later that evening, Martin stepped out onto the balcony of his room at the Lorraine Motel. It was chilly outside, but Martin was enjoying the fresh air. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. Martin fell to the ground. Martin Luther King Jr. was dead. The civil rights movement had lost its strongest voice. There he is on his balcony. James Earl Ray. On June 8, 1968, a white man named James Earl Ray was arrested for killing Martin Luther King Jr. James Earl Ray was born in Alton, Illinois on March 10, 1928. Ray was a small-time criminal. He robbed gas stations and stores. He was in prison 3 times, once in Illinois and twice in Missouri. So Alton, that's only 30 minutes away from where we are, which is kind of crazy. After Ray was arrested, he confessed. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. However, Ray later claimed he was innocent but could never prove it. In 1998, Ray died in prison. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the greatest civil rights leaders of all time. Today, people around the world still remember all he did in his fight for equality. After Martin's death, Coretta carried on her husband's fight. She traveled around the world and talked about peace. She fought to end segregation in South Africa. Coretta fought for civil rights until her death in 2006. Here she is. Yay, go Coretta. Martin's children carried on their father's message too. In 1997, Martin Luther King III was elected to head the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He stayed with the SCLC until 2004, and Martin's youngest daughter, Bernice, is a minister. She travels around the world speaking about civil rights. Martin's youngest son, Dexter, attended Morehouse College in 1997. Dexter visited James Earl Ray in prison. After speaking with Ray, Dexter was convinced that this man had not shot his father. Martin's oldest child, Yolanda, was an actress, author, and peace advocate. Yoki appeared in several films, including a mini-series about her father called King. She died on May 16, 2007. She was 51 years old. In 1980, Martin's boyhood home on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta and other buildings nearby were turned into National Historic Sites. Today, visitors can go to the museum to learn about Martin Luther King Jr.'s role in the civil rights movement. And in 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill to create a federal holiday to honor Martin. It observed on the third Monday of March each year, near the time of his birthday. In his very last sermon on April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about his own death. He hoped that people will remember him as a man who tried to give his life serving others. He wanted to be remembered for helping to feed the hungry and for loving people. 40 years later, people remember Martin Luther King Jr. and honor him for all this and more. All right, and then there was also a picture on this page. All right, and then at the very end, there's a timeline of all the different things that happened. I'll take a picture of this and post it on our online Google Classroom, so the online learning page. So if you haven't been added to that yet, make sure you go out on there and join it, because I've invited everyone from our class. So if you haven't joined it yet, go ahead and join it, because I've been posting a lot of fun things on there. All right, guys, see you tomorrow for our new book.